My name is Reverend Rai, and it's nice to see everybody. We know that the holidays are upon us and people are very busy, so I am truly grateful that you've taken time out of your schedule to join tonight. And I think with all the busyness around us, it's really nice for us to get the time to listen and talk about the Dharma specifically. So just to go over the format for those that might not be familiar with it, this is a simplified service. It's called Dharma Breeze. So what we will do is we will start with silent meditation. Then we will do a chant together. Then I will do a relatively short Dharma talk on a specific subject. We'll do a group reading, and then we will do a group discussion. At that time, we'll turn the Zoom off for confidentiality so everybody can express their feelings very openly. So I'd like us to start, please, with a silent meditation. So if you could please sit erect with your feet on the floor and your squares nice, your shoulders nice and relaxed. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namadats, namadats, namadats. So tonight we are going to chant the Juni Rai, which you can see at the PDF in the chat room. Last time we did this, we sped it up a little bit. It is one of our longer chants, and I'm not going to chant it quite as fast as we did last time, but I am going to increase the speed just a little bit so we can get through the melody. And I think hopefully you'll hear the melody more beautifully when we chant it a little bit quicker. So if you could please join me in chanting the Juni Rai. Tenshu tennin shokugyo amida senjo zokuson zai mimyu anako muryo bushi shuinyu konjiki shinjo nyosen no Shama tagyo nyozobu ryomoku jonyaku shorenge koga chorai midason menzen enjo nyomangats iko yunyo sennichigats Shonyo tenku kushira koga chorai midason Kwannon chodai kwanjuju 修十妙相法将言、農木下道魔教満、古賀将来未来尊、無美無垢交渉上、聖徳教血女国、小佐利悪徳自在、古賀将来未来尊、十法妙門菩薩衆、無量小魔上佐団、一生修上願力中、古賀将来未来尊、根体保険人生系、前後症状明大座、おひざ上如洗脳、古賀将来未来尊、十法将来勝負し、権限人図しやなく、戦後草原上業、古賀将来未来尊、小無常無我と、薬尿水月伝尿路、一種説法無名字、古賀将来未来尊、一尊無説無悪名、薬無女人悪道夫、主任死神教非尊、古賀将来未来尊、一尊無料法勉強、無少種悪知識、往生不退死菩提、古賀将来未来尊、画説非尊功徳寺、修善無変、如海水、小逆前言、小乗者、エセシュ上小彦ナマナナマナブナマナブナマナブナマナブナマナブ願にしく読、平等正祭、同壺大神、往生、な、 Nomadots, 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 nomadots. Well, that felt good. That was a nice workout, I think. So tonight we're going to be talking about entrusting. And before we go into that, I'd like to explain a little bit about why I teach the Dharma in the way that I do. Being a convert that was raised as a Christian, when I first came to Buddhism, it was very confusing for me because I thought that the structure of what spirituality or what religion was very firm in my mind from my Christian upbringing. So certain words and certain concepts just did not make sense to me when it came to Buddhism. And so it wasn't, I'll be perfectly honest. I spent many years going to the temple in Seattle. I spent years going to retreats at the Institute of Buddhist Studies. But it wasn't, excuse me, I was fortunate to be able to attend the Institute of Buddhist Studies because then I was taking classes that would explain all these different components of what Buddhism is or what the Dharma is. And I slowly kind of developed what I considered a skeleton for myself conceptually. And I discussed this last fall at Ekoji when I did the Introduction to Buddhist class. And what I talk about is kind of like, in my mind, kind of like a skeleton on how things are laid out. So the first point is the historical aspect of what is the institution of Buddhism. A lot of people that are unfamiliar think that it's just this monolithic thing. This is Buddhism, and it's the same school, and everybody follows the same practices. And indeed, if you are new to it and you go into the library or you go online, you'll start reading text and it'll be from a Tibetan source, it'll be from a Japanese source, and it's very, very confusing. So the skeleton is the historical component, which, as we all know, that the historical Buddha lived over 2,500 years ago in what is now India. But I think for me, one of the things that helped establish why Buddhism is so different is how it spread, that the Dharma did not stay stagnant in India. So the historical Buddha passed away and the monks continued to teach the teachings of what we call the Dharma. But as time went on, different time elements, different cultures, different concepts started coming into what was practiced or is taught as the Dharma. So for example, in India in 1200 BCE, what was taught at the universities or in the monasteries is very different than it was 1,000 years later. And as I've discussed in other talks, is that a lot of the early schools, a lot of the early transmission is like Sri Lanka, which is Theravada practices. And then it spreads out through Asia, through China and Japan, and that becomes different eras of Buddhism. They believe academically the last form of transmission of Dharma from the homeland of India is probably what is now what we consider Tibetan Buddhism. It was probably the last export of the Dharma. So for us, that's one way to look at the teachings. It's like, okay, there is lots of variances and this is the reason for it. And then, of course, we also talk about the doctrinal differences, that there are schools and every school tends to focus on one or several sutras that they say that we believe in all the Buddhist teachings, they're all relevant. However, the founder or the people that established this particular form of Buddhism or school feel that this one sutra encapsulates all of the essence of the Buddhist teaching. And as I've said many times before, that there is not one right way or wrong way. So for us in Jodo Shinshu, we follow the Pure Land teachings, the Pure Land sutras, where in, for example, Nichiren Shu, they follow the Lotus Sutra. So again, that doctrinal basis also shows how we go into the next thing that I talk about, which is ritual. So as I mentioned a few weeks ago, I had the person that was here from Indonesia, and he would do the full prostrations in front of our Onaijin here in New York. And that is not something that we would do, but I respected that as a fellow Buddhist, as that is his tradition. So this idea of that when we look at the Buddhist teachings, it's not this monolithic thing, it's this ever-evolving, changing form of expressing the Buddhist teachings or the Dharma. So with that in mind, because of my background, as you know, that I worked in social work for 20 years before I went into the ministry, my mind tends to think about the Dharma more in how do we relate to the Dharma? What are the things that we get out of the teachings? How does it improve our life? How does it improve how we relate to others? as we've said many times before, that the idea of specifically, especially Mahayana Buddhism, is that we're not supposed to keep the teachings to ourselves. We're supposed to take those teachings, help us ground ourselves in the spiritual tradition, and then to help others. And in past weeks, we've talked about what a bodhisattva is, what the different Buddhas are. These are all different manifestations of how we can express that. So today, before we go into the idea of entrusting, in my skeletal work of how Buddhism works, I want to phrase it in the sense of how we have our individual relationship to the Dharma. Because the word entrusting, I can see that Reverend Todd joined us. Hi, Sensei. When we go to IBS, we spend months, if not years, discussing all the different nuances in English and then the original language. And of course, we are trying to translate the words from the Japanese, which are a translation from the Chinese. We could go on to that forever. But the idea is that, again, with our personal connection, when you hear the word entrusting, what comes to mind? And again, we are going to have a discussion group after my talk, and we can talk about what it means to you. Now, what I would like to share, being raised Christian, is I've mentioned before that in the American society, or wherever you are in the world, especially European cultures, the Geo-Christian mindstruct is a very strong part of our general knowledge, our general culture. The Dharma talk that I gave here in New York this Sunday, we were talking about the different, how in Japanese culture, though people might not identify as Buddhist, the Buddhist influence is permeated into everything in the Japanese culture. So as I had mentioned previously, my grandmother was a very devout Christian. She lived to be 96 years old, bless her heart. And she was sharp until 2 weeks before her passing, when she had a stroke. My grandmother studied the Bible every day. Myself and other members of the family feel that intellectual stimulation is what kept her sharp. And you're not going to believe this. I'm 61, and my grandmother at 96 could bend over and touch the floor with the palm of her hands, bending forward. I can't do that at 61. It's pretty amazing. Also, my grandma loved to eat, and she lived in her own apartment with our helping her until she was 94. And we buy her groceries, and every week she'd eat a half gallon of ice cream. So the Bible and ice cream is what got my grandmother to be 96 years old. But and I really appreciated her spirituality in the sense that it enriched her life. And I think that how she viewed the world was through a prism of her Bible. And so when she would come visit me, because I was living in Washington, D.C., she was from Seattle, and she would come visit, and she'd say, now it's up to you, honey, do you want to do Bible study? And my mom would say, if it's okay with you, Kurt. So I did study the Bible up until I was about 15 or so. And that's when I've mentioned in other talks where I came to issues with some of the teachings. But I genuinely respect the Bible and the Christian teachings. And when it comes to entrusting, I came across a Bible verse that my grandmother really loved. And I think that this Bible verse, and first of all, I'm not comparing that it's a good verse or it's a bad verse. Buddhism is better than Christianity. It's not. It's just a comparison. But the idea of the concept of entrusting, I think, really is expressed very well in this. And so this is from Peter 4:19. And it says, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. Entrusting your soul to a faithful Creator means, I give myself to you. I give myself to you. God, you are faithful. You are powerful. Okay. So here from the Bible, and this is actually quite a popular verse that is quoted quite often. And so it's talking about suffering and that the people entrust themselves to God's will, their souls. Now, looking at that and comparing that, oh, I see Chris Lavino. Hi, Chris. The idea is that we understand that when we talk about the Buddha, first of all, we are not talking about a God creator. And again, this is an important part for our understanding of how the Buddha teachings, the Dharma, is different than Christianity. So now I would like to clarify very clearly that I have Christian friends that go to different forms of Christianity where they talk about God not as being a deity, not the man behind the cloud with the white beard, that they talk about God as being love, and that when they go to heaven, they are with God, and that is love, and hell is not being with God. So we don't want to oversimplify the idea of Christianity and how people interpret what God is. But in the common sense, the idea is very dualistic, that the God is the creator. And so therefore, there is the God and there is us. And therefore, we entrust to that God. And so again, very dualistic. One of the things that my mentor, Reverend Castro, would talk a lot about is that, for example, if you read the Bible, that they talk about that things are given on earth for us to use, to consume. So that means that all the animals, all the plants, everything, we have no qualms about consuming them because they were given by God to us. Whereas in Buddhism, I think we try to talk about interdependence and being understanding that we do need to take the lives of animals, but they're not necessarily there only for our consumption, that is much more complicated than that. So again, looking back at it from a very basic point of view, the other point that is quite different is that they talk about a soul. And this is a question that comes up quite often, is because in Buddhism, we talk about that there is no soul, or that's what people believe. But what we actually say is that there is no permanent soul. So again, the Buddha understands that in our everyday life that I am Kurt, and that I need to function, that I have all these components. I have this family history where my family comes from. All of these causes and conditions that have brought me here are real. However, when I physically leave this world, the idea is that in Shin Buddhism that we reach nirvana, or the Pure Land, reach enlightenment, and we're no longer going in that cycle of birth and death. And so there is no permanent soul. So that's why when we have someone that passes at a memorial service or a funeral, we give them the Homyo, or we give them the Buddhist name. That's our way of saying you are part of, part of the Shakyamuni family now, and that is how you're referred to. Whereas in the tradition Christianity, in this particular term, they're talking about this permanent soul that either goes to heaven or doesn't go to heaven, and we won't go into those details because in Christianity, it's very nuanced too what that means. But this idea of this permanent soul, that I am Kurt forever from now on. In Buddhism, we say on death, Kurt is released, and then we are one with nirvana and our Buddha nature. So returning to Shin Buddhism, so what does it mean when we say we entrust? And it can be the idea. So what do we entrust in? So it's easy for us to naturally have the conclusion that, okay, so I'm not entrusting in myself, I'm entrusting in Amida Buddha. And again, this can be confusing because if you read a lot of the writings of Shinran, there's this fluidity between when I take refuge in Amida, when I take refuge in the vow, when I take refuge. And I'll talk about that after we get through these concrete steps about what that means, because the Amida and all these different symbols tend to mean the same thing. But do we actually say that I'm entrusting in Amida? So that's something that we can talk about at the discussion group, because as I've mentioned before, I've had experiences where people have come into the Fresno temple and they are praying to the Amida statue. So in their viewpoint, they probably are entrusting literally in this Amida Buddha. But I think for us, and I think one of the eye openers, again, I was so fortunate to be able to go to seminary because we went through all these things, and Reverend Matsumoto is such an incredible teacher, is that what are we entrusting us? We're entrusting in that we are going to be born into the Pure Land. So here we are, we're taking the idea, we're not entrusting in Amida Buddha as a deity, as a person that's going to save us, but we are entrusting in the idea that we know that we are going to be born in the Pure Land, which is a different step. And so someone like myself that comes from a Christian background, that was very eye-opening. So what I would like to do is I would like to read a passage. This is not actually a passage. This is a definition in the glossary of the collected works of Shinran, which is a great resource for those that have the double volume. This is the smaller volume, and it has a nice glossary to help you as a study guide. But for us today, I think the way that they describe it is very helpful, from having us to think of as trusting from a deity or an entity to this idea of actually receiving, going to the Pure Land itself. And so in the dictionary, they worked very hard in 1997 to try to incorporate as many English words as they could. However, that's limited. And Eric Ishii's not here today. He's at MAP training in Berkeley. I talked to him already today. But the idea is that even now, and Hongzan, our head temple in Japan, they're saying this needs to be changed. So there's always this constant chain of the understanding of the Dharma or Shinran's words, especially when it comes to English. So in the word in English, the entry is entrusting, comma, shinjin. And I know that shinjin is a very important word for all of us, and that's a whole section in itself, but they are interconnected. And so what he says here is that it's shingyo. So shingyo is a synonym for shinjin derived from the 18th vow, with sincere mind entrusting shingyo, themselves aspiring to be born to my pure land. So shin means to entrust oneself, and gyo means to aspire for birth in the pure land, and also rejoice in the realization of shinjin. So again, I think especially when we talk about it, and at Ekoji, we've got lots of people that have a lot of knowledge about Buddhism. And so sometimes after service, we talk about what is Shinjin and who has Shinjin. It's very easy for us to go down that path. Instead of talking about it as a condition or as a state, it's something that's talking about is that it's something that we're moving towards, and not whether we have it or whether it's established. I've met so many of the Japanese ministers that smile that says, if someone says, I have Shinjin, I don't think they have Shinjin, because you're not aware if you have it. It's something primal. It's something that you experience, but not necessarily you're aware of. So here at the bottom of the definition, it says, Shinran writes, Shingyo is the mind that brings all beings to supreme nirvana. Again, this is important. Shingyo is the mind that brings all beings to supreme nirvana. Here, the distinctive character of Mahayana Buddhism, in which one works to anticipate all beings before crossing into nirvana oneself, is clearly expressed. Okay, so thank you, translators, for all your work in trying to translate this into English so that we can understand it. So I think, without oversimplifying it, is that for us as human beings, that when we look and we try to express we talk about gratitude in Shin Buddhism. And so we say, I'm grateful for the teachings. And then not at Ekoji, because Ekoji has a nice, simplistic Onaijin. But when you go to the other temples, Midwest, when you come to New York, you've got the traditional Onaijin with the Buddha and Shinran and everybody there. And so we acknowledge that it's easier for people to say, I am grateful to Amida Buddha. Amida Buddha represents the Tathagata, which is a multi-dynamic word that means more than just the Buddha. It's the teachings. It's kind of like a verb. It's an interaction. So for us, out of our convention, so at Ekoji, you've got the Myogo written in kanji, Namo Amida Butsu. So you can look at that. And then for us, it's like for us to express that. So the idea is that when we say entrust, we're not entrusting a deity or another person. And then that's acknowledging about not having self-power, that we understand that there is this universal truth that we are submerged in. And so the idea is that we try to acknowledge that. So when we say that I entrust, so some people say I entrust the three treasures, which is easy, but as Shin Buddhists, we entrust the process of the Shinjin of realizing that we're all equal and that we're all going to the Pure Land. So I hope that makes sense, and hopefully we'll have a nice conversation out of that, because the word entrusting does have so many different connotations. So what I'd like to do is I would like to conclude with us doing a group reading before the silent meditation, please. And if we could do the Shinshu Creed with number 2, please. Entrusting in the vow of the Buddha and reciting the sacred name, I shall proceed through the journey of life with strength and joy, revering the light of the Buddha and reflecting upon my imperfect self. I shall strive to live a life of gratitude. Following the teachings of the Buddha and discerning the right path, I shall spread the true Dharma. Rejoicing in the compassion of the Buddha, respecting and abiding others, aiding others, I shall do my best to work towards the welfare of society. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Butsu. So if we can just do a very short silent meditation before we open up to the discussion group, please. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Butsu. Namo Butsu. Namo Butsu.